Good afternoon. The presentation has three parts. First, what is an idea for a building? Second, how should we study buildings? And third, why a building should be built with one material only. Your professor, Devin Dobrovolsky, has asked me to address questions that are directly applicable for students who design buildings. I have therefore decided to leave all philosophical or theoretical background away and address these three questions in the most straightforward way. Of course, the reason why I'm speaking to you today is that, so I have been told, all third-year students at the University of Virginia's School of Architecture have been assigned to read the book Non-Referential Architecture, a book I have authored together with architect Valerio Olgiati. Here, 4 of the covers of the soon-to-be 7. Let me take the opportunity to thank UVA, its School of Architecture, its faculty, and last but not least, you, the students, for your invitation to be here with you. I would like to thank you for the interest you demonstrate to discuss architecture from the vantage point of making buildings, rather than one of the many extra architectural discussions, not to say non-architectural discussions, with which architects, academics, university professors in particular, but also museum curators or magazine editors attempt to justify buildings these days, if they are willing to discuss buildings at all. While I have been invited to your school 2 or 3 times before, I think this specific invitation would not have happened if it would not be for Professor Katie McDonald. I had the distinct pleasure to teach along Katie for a year or so. So thank you very much to both of you for the invitation, Devin and Katie. Also, I would rather be in Charlottesville in person, but we do that the next time around. Let me also extend a hello to my current students and former students who are listening in today. In particular, I want to point to Andrew Montgomery, who teaches at UVA sometimes and has an office in Charlottesville. Andrew, together with his office partner, Stephen Townsend, another former student of mine, are currently very busy as architect of record of the Manoak House that internationally acclaimed architect Valerio Olgiati is preparing to build in Virginia. So maybe the next time or the next event we can do together is that Andrew is taking all of you to visit the Manoak House once it is finished. The Manoak House is going to be the most radical architectural project to be built in Virginia since Eero Saarinen's Dallas Airport terminal in 1962. So much for the acknowledgement. Now back to the lecture. Since you have already read the book Non-Referential Architecture, the 3 topics I am addressing today are taken from the 3rd and 4th chapter of the introduction part of the book, and then also from the 4th principle, construction. There are 2 qualities or 2 attributes that an idea for a building must have. An idea must be form generative and it must be sense making. Before we discuss these 2 attributes of an architectonic idea, there are 3 other important stipulations. First, while it is not easy to conceive a viable idea for a building that reverberates in people's imagination, the expression of such an idea should not be complicated or convoluted. An idea for a building can be conveyed in one sentence or even one phrase. Therefore, an idea should not be mistaken as something vague or elusive and thus difficult to express. We do not understand ideas for buildings as something esoteric, that is, as it were, exists nebulously and cannot be defined. Instead, an idea for a building should be exceedingly lucid. However, this does not mean that an idea for a building cannot embody spiritual and metaphysical quality of the highest order. On the contrary, good ideas for buildings possess such qualities, as it is precisely those ideas that trigger repercussions in people's minds and souls. The point to be made here is that, however complex and rich an idea is, an idea for a building must be defined and described cogently, convincingly, and compellingly. Therefore, an idea for a building has to be defined to a degree that it allows an architect to have logical clarity as to what kind of building they are going to design. We are not saying that the eventual building, as it will stand in front of us once it has been constructed, must be fully describable. That is impossible. However, the idea for a building must be sufficiently describable as a construct in the mind of the architect, because the clarity alone allows the architect to begin and draw a building with the consistency of a holistic construct. To contrast this, without a clearly defined idea for a building is nothing more than a bricolage, a way of thinking in which something is added whenever one doesn't know any further. The bricolage thinking is a tactics that might work, maybe, in the domain of rhetoric, but is wholly unfit for anyone who wants to conceive buildings. In other words, nothing holistic can be done without an idea. Second, an architect has to have a defined idea of the building before she or he draws the first line on a paper or with a computer, or makes the first cut into cardboard to build a model. The approach to design that an architect just somehow begins with a sketch to search for something and then hopes to arrive at something is nothing more than the perpetuation of the notion of a genius. But very few of us are geniuses. More importantly, this approach does not lead to buildings of architects you might admire. Mies van der Rohe, Palladio, Frank Gehry, Frank Lloyd Wright, despite the fact that some of them presented themselves as geniuses at times. Still, this is the second thing you need to remember. The idea is defined before you begin to draw or model it. Third, ideas have always been the kernel of good buildings. However, the idea has gained in significance for buildings in our highly heterogeneous world, a world that some have labeled atomistic world, a world we call non-referential world, not because architects will not use references anymore, but because these references do not mean anything any longer to a large enough segment of the population. In the absence of common ideals, as they existed in the past, each building that is erected today requires its own idea. Because we find ourselves in a situation in which believable ideals do not exist in today's world, the architect is no longer supplied with a set of guidelines on how to design a building. It is now the responsibility of the architect to author an idea for a building. The situation in which each building requires its own idea is a consequence of the liberated world for which people have been advocating for a few centuries now. Now to the first attribute of an architectonic idea. An idea for a building has to be form generative. Being form generative is the first of the two indispensable qualities that an idea for a building must have. For example, the architect might declare that the idea is to build a secluded garden. When the idea is declared in such lapidary terms, it is not the programmatic function that defines the idea, but its form generative qualities. Every architect claims to have an idea, but what they often mean when they say they have an idea is that they can merely describe either the program or the shape of the building they intend to make. However, if an architect declares the intention to build a secluded garden, the idea describes a formal intention. The purpose is, of course, implied by its functional designation, but if an architect intends to build a secluded garden, what makes it form generative is not the function, but the fact that the idea is an enclosed room. An idea is only architectonic if it implies a form. In other words, the idea articulates something in such a way that you can imagine a form. Ideas must be form generative. To use the aforementioned example, it is quite easy to immediately conjure up a formal image of a secluded garden. Everybody may not imagine a secluded garden in exactly the same way as the architect does when they describe the idea to someone, but more or less everyone will have quite a defined image of a secluded garden. For example, the architect might describe the secluded garden as being surrounded by high walls, mention that there is an opening in the middle of the four walls, that it has a water feature in the center, and that it is otherwise filled with exotic plants and trees. Contrary to such form generative ideas, if an architect states that their idea is to build an inexpensive house, this is not a form generative idea. Such a description does not contain a formal idea. It is also not an idea if an architect says that they intend to build a white building or a small building. Nor is it an idea to declare the intention to build a house in reinforced concrete, to announce that a house is self-sufficient with regard to energy, or to proclaim that you will build a church. None of these examples are form generative and do not, therefore, suffice as useful ideas for a building. There is an important distinction to be made here about the idea regarding its place in the creative process. Using the analogy of literature, it could be said here that the idea is the story. The idea is the formulation of something principled in the sense of an intention, but it is not the actual devising of how a building will be manifest architectonically. Therefore, an idea has manifold ways of being ordered and subsequently formulated into an actual building. The idea is the description of a formal intention, but it is articulated prior to the conception of an order for that idea. Hence, when we discuss the idea for a building, the idea assumes a fairly specific place within the sequence of the creative process of conceiving a building. It is important to make the distinction between an idea, an order, and an actual architectonic formulation in material terms. As such, we can surmise that first, there is some kind of wish. For example, somebody would like a place where they can be alone. In reference to the analogy to literature, this would be the genre, for example, drama or science fiction. Second, there is the idea. For example, the idea of a secluded garden. In literature, this would be the story of a drama or a science fiction narrative. Third, there is the ordering system. For example, it is a rectangular garden that is enclosed with walls. In our analogy, this would be the plot that gives structure to the story. Fourth, we have the particular cause and effect of a story. For a building, this is the concrete architectonic formulation. For example, the material used in its construction, its color, how tall the surrounding walls are, and what kind of trees and plants will be planted in this garden. Therefore, the idea for a building is not the same as the architectural order. For example, if the architect says that their house has 3 walls or 3 columns, then these are the ordering systems of the building, but not the idea. To describe a building as a house with 3 walls or a house with 3 columns does not say anything about its form generative idea. This brings us to the second attribute that an idea must have. An idea must be sense-making. We have not yet addressed the fact that not all ideas are worthy of being pursued. There are good ideas and bad ideas for buildings. However, it is very challenging to discuss what makes for a good idea in the abstract without having an actual task for the building at hand. Hence, it cannot be our intention here to discuss what good ideas for buildings would be in abstract, non-concrete terms. Nevertheless, if an architect declares, for example, that they want to build a sphere, it is not a good idea per se, even though the sphere does have a form and could therefore be understood as a form generative intention. Instead, an architect would also have to know why they would want to build a sphere. It would then be possible to consider and discuss whether the reasons why an architect wants to build a sphere are good or bad. Other examples include those referred to above. Not only is a house with 3 walls or a house with 3 columns not form generative, the question as to why a house with 3 walls or a house with 3 columns is sense-making would also have to be addressed. What can be stated here without hesitation, however, is that ideas exist that lead to nothing. As it is impossible to make a good building from a bad idea, introspection is needed on the part of the architect to begin anew if the conclusion is reached that an idea is bad. An idea for a building is sense-making if it provokes some kind of cognizance or insight in the mind of the inhabitant. We could call it a kind of truth argument. The architect's idea must contain a certain feeling of discovery, from the outset of its conception. We simply stipulate here that the idea must contain some kind of insight, something sense-making, because it is impossible to list all the possibilities about what such an insight could be. This is an admittedly broad and open-ended definition. However, it will have to remain so, as any attempt to fixate it will always fall short of all the possibilities for new sense-making ideas. What is certain, however, is that an idea must be sense-making to be capable of stirring people's imagination. One thing I probably have to clarify here. Remember that we distinguished ideals from the idea earlier in the lecture. The fact that we don't have ideals anymore that a large enough segment of the people believe in has direct consequence for how we need to understand sense-making. This could almost be another lecture, but let me just say here, when we believed in ideals, buildings were the representation of those ideals. And the sense-making occurred by looking at the building and understanding the meaning of its representation. Today, that would not work anymore. Today, the sense-making for people occurs if a building makes people creative and they begin to make their own thoughts. Sense-making today occurs when people extend their own possibilities. In any case, an idea for a building must be both form generative and sense-making. How should architects study buildings? As architects, we want to study and learn from existing buildings and we attempt to make sense of them. How do we conceptualize a building? What is important for us when we encounter a building and decide to study it? It is important for an architect who conceives and designs buildings to understand how she or he studies buildings. It is important to understand this because architects are not historians. Let me say from the outset here that what historians study about buildings is not particularly meaningful for architects who intend to design buildings. It is important to distinguish whether one studies a building formally or socially. The historian studies buildings socially. The architect studies buildings formally. The difference of how an architect and a historian study buildings has to do with what sort of understanding they want to extract from a building they decide to study. For the lack of a better architectural term, when architects study buildings formally, they are studying buildings genealogically. Again, this is in stark contrast to analyzing and understanding buildings socially. The genealogic analysis of a building, we could also say metaphorically, the analysis of its DNA is the analysis of its space constellation. It may be stated that the space constellation, this is essentially space, how it factually exists, is the DNA of a building. We argue that if architects study buildings, we study their genealogy foremost. Therefore, if an architect attempts to understand a building, the formal attributes of the building is what must be studied. We can surmise that the formal space constellation of buildings contains everything that is necessary for an architect to understand a building. The statement that the space constellation contains everything that needs to be understood is also an acknowledgement that not everything about a building can be conceptualized. The realization that not everything that we could possibly study about a building is particularly meaningful for the architect is perhaps even more important. To study the formal space constellation of buildings is to study the inherent architectonic of a building. It brings us closer to what a building is basically about than any other possible aspect of a building that we also could analyze and draw conclusions from, such as the historical and representational contents. Studying this fundamental basis of a building is important because when we study buildings, it is not about the general deciphering of social history so as to understand the world conception of one or the other historical people. This is not the architect's task, nor does it inform them much if the aim is to learn something about how to conceive buildings. To clarify, buildings are not to be studied primarily through the extra-architectural lenses of the historical and social, as it is customary in academic courses on the history of architecture at universities. Buildings should be studied formally and thus timelessly. In other words, a building is studied as an object that does not have a time. For example, the chronological study of the course of architecture is rather unimportant if the aim is for the architect to learn about designing a building. Of course, there is no objection whatsoever to students of architecture enrolling in courses on the history of architecture and to enjoying them and learning a great deal as long as there is no misconception what such historical and social studies of buildings generate, and the understanding of what is important and helpful for the design of buildings by the practicing architect. Very important, there is no implication here that the practicing architect should not study buildings from the past. On the contrary, the architect learns an incredible amount by visiting and studying buildings from the past, and they should do so often and in detail. However, the practicing architect does not gain much at all from studying buildings as a representation of something outside themselves, namely from studying buildings as an abstraction of an extra architectural concept, such as religious, state, or private ideals. For example, the formal constellation of buildings are best studied without any consideration whatsoever of the biographical information about who erected them and why. With this in mind, it is often advantageous for the architect if nothing is known about the civilization that erected a given building. It is actually better for an architect to not know who commissioned a building, why it was built, and what program and function it served. There is an important difference between genealogy and history. Sometimes genealogy is labeled an auxiliary science without which history cannot be properly conducted. Historians remind us correctly that genealogy is important, but that it is not history. History, the much younger of the two disciplines, is a new branch of inquiry that emerged in the late 18th century and then established itself fully throughout the 19th century. History's objective is not the study of the accumulated information per se. Instead, it requires a critical approach to the sources with a view to enabling the presentation of cause and effect. With respect to the study of a building, the historical method is less concerned with the actual attributes of the structure and focuses more on the interpretation of these attributes. However, genealogy remains useful for history because history cannot be conducted without it. It is its foundation, a fact that is also important for the high esteem with which genealogy is held. While genealogy was considered only barely a science by historians and other scholars, it is also noteworthy that genealogical studies hold great sway over the popular imagination, probably more so than academic history. It may be speculated that the reason for the popularity of the genealogical is that genealogical results are less the result of intellectualization and ideological convictions and are thus far more basic. To be basic is of great value for an architect who wants to construct a building. This is the case because conceiving and constructing a building is a very basic physical undertaking. Therefore, the advantage of genealogical research is that it passes down information relatively unchanged from the source. In other words, genealogy presents basic physical facts such as information about the dimension of rooms, the material a room is built with, the measurements of columns, the placement and size of openings, the thickness of walls, how a person enters a room, etc. The architect wants to know the tangible physical formal, in the full knowledge that there is still plenty in a building that is not quantifiable. While the tangible physical formal in this sense is basic for the practicing architect, it holds great complexities. On the contrary, historical information that a certain building is, for example, a masterpiece of a certain historical epoch because it is an exceptional representation of a certain worldview, is not particularly useful for an architect. It is also not particularly useful to know who the architect was or who built it. In contrast, the genealogy of architectonic ordering systems seeks out the concrete and the formal. The genealogical is useful because spaces are first and foremost perceived with a very basic sense by inhabitants and visitors of buildings. Rooms are perceived formally, not as information. A very good example for demonstrating how a building is analyzed formally is this palace. The palace is a case in point of spatial hierarchies and how these ordering systems coexist with each other. Of particular interest is how the two largest rooms are connected. The room with a row of 6 pillars is a space that is directional and conveys the impression of existing outside of the center. It is entered in the middle. The other room has 4 openings, each located in the exact center of the peripheral walls. The connection between the 2 rooms is simply somewhere. In fact, you enter the room diagonally, and because of that shift, you experience it spatially. The room with the openings in all 4 directions feels primary than the one with the row of pillars. If you were to enter the room through one of the 4 openings in the middle of the walls, you would not experience the space as primary in a spatial sense. Instead, you would experience it more intellectually. It would be more a part of an idea about the absolute. Then we would perhaps only think of it as primary because of that intellectualization. The way it is in this palace, you experience the room spatially and purely architectonically. The experience of these 2 spaces is different because you have to exit and enter outside of the main axis of the two rooms. That the hallway is a spatial sequence can be detected at the corner where two rectangular rooms make for a kind of an overlay. The fact that you have to turn before entering the next room further heightens the awareness of the different hierarchies. If buildings are studied by means of their ordering systems, the architect gains an absolute architectonic understanding of how a building is ordered. Ultimately, no names, no years, no background information are necessary to understand buildings. This example serves as a demonstration of how to study architecture. Instead of studying buildings historically or symbolically or in any other referential mode, buildings should be studied formally. Buildings benefit if they are constructed of one single material. To construct a building with a single material presents the formal intention unequivocally. Old buildings were largely built in a single material, mostly either in stone or timber. Today, it is often argued that it is no longer possible to construct buildings in a single material due to complex technical, environmental, and legal requirements. However, there is evidence that it is still possible to construct technically highly complex buildings in a single material. When we look at old buildings, for example, the basilica in the Apulian city of Rouen, we see a building that is essentially built of stone. There are some other materials such as the wooden doors, and there is also some glass. The stone roof is also covered with terracotta tiles for protection. However, it is essentially a building made of one material. The abbey at Le Toronnet has a similarly concise material palette. Even some of the roofs there is made out of the same stone as the walls and floors. Similar yet even more radically succinct materialization can be seen in Fatehpur Sikri, a city in the Indian region of Uttar Pradesh. These examples are provided here to indicate what is meant by constructing a building out of one material. Yes, there are other materials present, but these mainly relate to the apertures. Other than the materials used for the apertures, these buildings are built entirely with one material. To illustrate this point, if the entire front facade of the basilica in Rouen, namely its pilasters, portals, Lombard band, ornament, and everything else had not been built in a single material, but in different ones, the architectonic idea of the building, in this case, of enormous weight pushing down to the earth, while there is a big room inside, would not be understood. If the basilica were built with several materials, it would be impossible to feel and comprehend the idea of heaviness and the open room, because multiple materials would dissolve and differentiate the idea. Even more dramatic is the example in Fatehpur Sikri. The fact that all buildings, each of them unique, are built in the same red stone emphasizes the idea of the unification of the many. The decision with which material a building is built is ultimately the choice of the architect, because there is no causal relationship between idea and material. While there is no absolute causal relationship between idea and material, it is important, however, that the choice of the material by the architect is still deduced from the idea for the building. Deciding on the material with which a building is built is not unlike selecting a language with which a story is told or a text is written. To remain with this analogy, in many cases, it would be possible to write a given text and describe the same plot in one language or another. However, the language with which a text is written changes the text. The same is true for a building. For example, it is possible to design a secluded garden with either steel, reinforced concrete, or timber. But needless to say, these rooms would look different. The structural concept would also be different. It is the freedom of the architect to select the language that they speak, but it is also the architect's task to decide on a material for a building. That material becomes the basis for the building's formal qualities. It is not the case that an idea must always be implemented with only one and the same material. Again, if the idea is to build a secluded garden, it can be defined in various materials: stone, masonry, timber. However, this choice is a limited one. The architect's choice is guided by the fact that the building needs to be built in the one material that best gives it the ability to transport the idea for that building. For example, concrete has the attribute of being a casted material. Thus, it would not make sense to cast in concrete a building whose idea requires a modular form. On the other hand, it is the very nature of brick that it always results in something modular, because a brick is a small, typically rectangular module. Therefore, it is also nonsensical to build an irregular undulating shape in masonry. So to some degree, the choice of a material for a building is a personal choice of the architect, but that selection should not be mistaken as an unencumbered one. Of course, it is also important to note that the dimension of a building limit the material choices. However, rather than amplifying the choice of one material or other for a building, it is more important to emphasize the importance of the fact that an intentional choice must actually be made. It must then be stressed that the material choice must bring utmost consequentiality. If an architect stipulates that he or she conceives a building in timber, steel, or reinforced concrete, it should mean something. In other words, if an architect declares, for example, that a building is being built in timber, then it ought to be a building that is fundamentally built in that material and exploits the inherent possibilities of timber in all its characteristics. It is very unsophisticated to declare a building as a timber building and, for example, have the joints made out of metal. In this case, it is no longer a timber building because the material attributes of timber are removed with the addition of metal in precisely the part of a structure that is crucial for making a timber building exactly that, a timber building. As a result, a building becomes very quickly a mere jumble of materials. Here we see the 14th century Spreuerbrücke in my hometown in Switzerland. And you see it was renovated, and you see underneath the steel plates that have been introduced into the structure, and really making this not anymore a real timber bridge. Even worse is the complete absence of an intentional declaration as to the material with which a building is being constructed. We can also say that buildings with many materials and without a recognizable primary material are testimonies of the absence of ideas for buildings and the most direct evidence of their futility. If no decision is made for a particular material, the outcome is usually a building in which the attributes of multiple materials compete with each other. In this case, the material-specific attributes of these different materials will offset each other. And then you have a condition that everything seems possible. It is all but impossible to build a coherent formal whole if a building has materials for its primary structure with very different attributes. This building is a good example of a building built in one material only. It is also a demonstration of a symbiosis of form and structure and the specific attributes of a material. The building has an outer appearance that does not allow much for the comprehension of the total building organism. It appears from the outside that this building does not require any columns. If you were to see only the inside of the building, it also appears that no columns are necessary. It is only once you have seen the entire building in time that you begin to construct it in your mind, and you will understand why it has columns and why the columns are sized and placed in the way they are. For example, if a visitor were to enter the auditorium through the back entrance from the cafeteria side, that visitor would conceive of the beams and the columns as decorative elements. This is the case even more so because of the specific position where these structural elements are placed within the room, as well as the fact that each of the columns and beams is present only one single time. It is also unusual that these columns and beams are dimensioned very slim and very fat in the same room. In this auditorium, there is one column along the tall wall that does not even reach the ground. There is a pillar that is perpendicular to the slanted roof surface. There is a transverse horizontal beam, and there is one very large longitudinal beam that is slanted in the angle of the roof. Not to forget are the walls and the roof that are stretched across these elements like the skin of a tent. All of this is materialized in reinforced concrete. It is a minutely calibrated organism that allows the building to stand up. This particular building is not just about these structural qualities. There is, for example, the question why it is so tall, why the room is very dark, why the openings are shaped in the way they are, and how they have been placed that are also the result of the idea and the material. Sorry, the aspect of the structure of the auditorium that I emphasize here is just one good example to demonstrate that the idea of this building benefits that the entire building is built in one material. Thank you.